What role does trust play in context of violence and repression? What factors contribute to the erosion and the emergence of trust? Can relations of trust even exist in situations of extreme uncertainty like civil wars? These questions are not just theoretical, but have real-world implications, especially in light of the increasing armed conflicts like the war in Ukraine or recent events in the Middle East. Peace, which hinges on a certain degree of justified trust, is elusive when faced with the reality of armed conflicts. At ConTrust, we delve into these topics, exploring how extreme uncertainty can be managed and possibly overcome, and how wars can be contained and perhaps ended. This moves us into the field of international relations, whose expertise is currently needed more than ever. If we want to understand the dynamics of radicalization and to find the drivers of and solutions to violence, we need political science analyses of the connections between peace and conflict. In a highly complex world fraught with many different contexts of conflict, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions to be expected, but rather situational insights that shed light on other contexts and contribute to the constructive handling of conflicts. To help us navigate these issues and investigate what role trust plays in contexts of violence and oppression, I'm joined by a renowned scholar in international relations and peace and conflict studies, Irene Weipert-Fenner. Before we embark on our conversation, I would like to briefly introduce you to our audience. Since 2023, Irene is coordinator of the research group Regime Competition at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, where she works as a senior research fellow. She is also a principal investigator in the ConTrust initiative. Her excellent research as a comparative political scientist centers around the topic of authoritarian regimes, democratization, as well as protests and social movements, with a regional focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Great to have you here, Irene. So let's talk about the research paper that you and Hannah Pfeiffer wrote together, which is on violent conflicts, but also social movements. So there are countless conflicts of conflict in which the question of trust is relevant and pressing. In previous episodes, we have looked into specific economic, legal, and epistemic contexts. Could you please clarify why you and your colleague Hannah Pfeiffer, who is also a principal investigator here at ConTrust, chose to explore the role of trust in violent conflicts and pair that with an analysis of the role of trust in non-violent conflicts as well? So why put these two together in a paper?
Well, thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me here and for the opportunity to explain a little bit what we did by, as you said, right, kind of comparing violent and non-violent mobilization and conflicts. Actually, I mean, that was the whole idea of ConTrust, to say that trust can grow and can develop in the most unlikely conditions that we tend to think. And actually, so my research on revolutions and mass uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa had exactly shown that suddenly people worked together who had no trust in each other before, be it from different sects, different political, ideological groups, and suddenly there was a revolution, people worked together. And I might talk about this later in more detail, but suddenly there was trusting, at least the action of trusting, and the question, where would this come from? And together with my colleague Hannah Pfeiffer, who works on rebel governance, so question how non-state armed actors can generate trust in a context of violent conflict, the idea was to say that maybe there is something special to the extraordinariness of extreme uncertainty. So when everything is open. So when political institutions are not in place anymore, when in revolutions you question the whole regime, when you try to build up something completely new, there's extreme high risks, which make trust so necessary. And at the same time, the future is open to being shaped, which creates certain emotions, which might open up ways also for new forms of trusting. And this is how we came to compare these two.
Yeah, we'll certainly touch on the issue of uncertainty towards the end of our conversation. Let's talk about the study in another aspect here. It addresses, amongst other things, two research gaps in the field of international relations. First, it examines trust dynamics with regard to rebel governance. We already heard about that during an ongoing armed conflict. And second, from the viewpoint of mass mobilization against the regime in post-conflict societies. What were you expecting to find in the research that you did in the MENA region of the Middle East and North Africa? And what were the particular results that you found that really took you by surprise?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, maybe for the audience also important to know that when we think about revolutions in the Arab world, we tend to think of the so-called Arab Spring, right? We think about 2011, we think of the Tahrir Square in Cairo, Tunisia, and how many revolutions went down a very tragic trajectory, like in Syria and Yemen and so on. However, there was a second wave of uprisings in 2019. Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, those 4 countries also saw revolutions, toppled regimes, they toppled presidents and governments. And the fascinating thing was, back in 2011, these countries hadn't seen mass uprisings. And one explanation was that all of these countries had experiences of violence, of civil conflict, like Algeria, the civil war, Sudan, we all know that, right? Lebanon, Iraq. Iraq even recently had seen the mass violence around the so-called Islamic State. And so back in 2011, the argument was to say that these countries weren't going for revolutions because people were afraid. And they were afraid of violence, of regimes falling apart and having chaos and anarchy. And then suddenly in 2019, it's exactly these countries that, that see these mass uprisings. So I was really surprised, saying, like, how could this happen? So why was there suddenly trust in other sects, other groups, when it wasn't there in 2011? So I started digging deeper into this because from social movement theory, we know that trust is important when you start mobilization in general, and particularly in high-risk contexts such as authoritarian regimes. And also post-conflict societies, exactly that, right? But what we've also seen was not only the starting point was something to be explained, but also how it evolved. And this was something where social movement theory was kind of showing a gap to us, that we didn't know anything about what was going to happen with trust during mobilization. Because the first days of revolution, you might still explain with emotions, with like very intense emotions. And it still plays a huge role how we explain trust during that time. But still things happen. There are, different groups that have to coordinate. You have to also navigate conflicts within the groups. You have to organize yourself. You have to deal with a regime that tries to end this, try to see distrust also among protesters. So there was a huge research gap to actually look at how the moment of uncertainty, which turns out to be a phase of uncertainty because revolutions become longer and longer. So we have like 6 months, even a year of mass uprisings. So this was very complex interplay of different factors explaining trust dynamics. And this was something I wanted to look deeper into. And as you asked for the most surprising thing, for me, it was how to see different strategies, how protesters build trust deliberately, I would say, at least by symbolically bridging certain gaps. So, for instance, Iraq and Lebanon were 2 cases I looked more closely into. These countries are marked by a sectarian or ethno-religious divides, as I like to call them. And during the protests, you could really see how one group sent out signals to the other group showing that we are here as one, usually united under the banner of nationalism. So Shiite protesters in Iraq, for instance, would take one of the flags symbolizing Shiites in Iraq and raise the Iraqi flag next to it. And so certain performances as well to create a new identity and to create trust in that sense were the most surprising thing to me to see.
And so just a quick follow-up. So would you say that there is an almost uniform pattern that can be detected across all of these different contexts? As you were saying, symbolic trust building maybe through recourse to nationalism in particular? Or is it a predominant pattern, at least you'd say?
Yeah, I think really, so the pattern is that the national frame, the national identity is something people relate to and try to kind kind of reinterpret certain symbols, certain performances. You could also see that in Algeria, for instance, where you have the Amazigh population being culturally diverse, and it used to be a dividing line of society dating back to the colonial times. And during the revolution there, it was one, like also the one Amazigh region was one of the strongholds of the revolution. But still, it was again the flags, right? The Amazigh flag next to the Algerian flag. You could even see that in the regional uprising in Morocco, where you also have the Amazigh population. It didn't reach the national level, but for 6 months we had a regional uprising, massive, in 2016. And again, here, people try to bridge this and also kind of, counter any attempts of a government to divide a mass uprising along these social divides.
That's fascinating. Let's move a step back from these cases and talk about the understanding of trust in the field of international relations more generally. In order to take different trust dynamics into account and analyze how they interact with each other, you introduced the distinction between vertical or political trust and horizontal or interpersonal trust. Why is this distinction relevant for trust in research in political science? And beyond that, is there a relation, or how would you characterize the relation between these two dimensions when it comes to empirical findings as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So I don't want to say that I invented this, otherwise I would I would deserve an award or something. But there's something like we work with something that was out there already, right? So political and social trust is one familiar distinction of vertical, horizontal trust. But what we found also in the working groups I was part of was to say that we need to differentiate this a little bit more. We need to disaggregate. So political trust, what does that mean? Trust in whom exactly? So take different institutions, because there, when you take a look at surveys, you see different trust levels, also across authoritarian regimes, for instance, right? It's not. So this is something important to acknowledge, that, of course, there is trust also in authoritarian regimes, but it can be directed to very different institutions. And so this is one thing, right? Disaggregate the actors and disaggregate the same also on the social level. So what we usually do with social trust is we talk about generalized trust, so trust in people I don't know, and then personalized trust in people I know. Then there is in-group and out-group trust, also well established. But how is this all interlinked? And particularly with the revolutionary uprisings I mentioned before, we found that this is not fine-grained enough. For instance, there's vertical trust inside movements, inside coalitions. So what we think we need to develop this further. Then there is research on how these different trust types are interconnected. Of course, it's important, and we also tend to have maybe a kind of biased view towards it, to say that there's an upward spiral in democracy. So you have political trust, and there's also higher social trust then. So there's a positive connection here. And we tend to assume there's a downward spiral if you take a look at, again, authoritarian regimes. There's also great research down on the MENA region to say that there's low political trust and also low social trust, and this is interconnected. Again, this is not fine-grained enough, I would say, particularly when you take a look at groups that organize, that mobilize. You can see different interconnections. There was a special issue I co-edited with 3 colleagues. One was also like Jonas Wolf, another PI here at ConTrust. And here we really had comparative cases from all over the world, from democracies, autocracies, etc. And what we really saw here was how counterintuitive trajectories can be. For instance, in the Belarusian revolution, we could see that trust in the political institutions, of course, that's the idea of a revolution, is extremely low. But by participating in a revolution, social trust increased. So it's not just the case that generally trust is low and everything is gone. And the same goes for research also on rebel governance, on civil wars, where we see that while the general trust might be low, but particularly because you rely so much more on others, on your surrounding, on your environment, like the people you know, but also the networks you rely on, you trust them even more. So there is something you can also build on then in post-conflict societies.
Well, if things were not complicated enough with that distinction of vertical and horizontal trust, you also introduce another distinction, and I didn't mean to say invent, but introduce certainly, that distinction between, on the temporal scale, between synchronous and diachronic trust dynamics in peace and conflict research. This implies that trust, whether political or social, should not only be seen as a momentary phenomenon, but also as a nonlinear processual phenomenon that evolves and adapts over time. How can this be demonstrated by the observed dynamics of trust in the field of civil wars and mass mobilization?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because sometimes we tend to think like trust is just an evaluation of current situation, particularly in political trust. We have this, right? It's related to performance. If performance is low, trust is low. Performance is great, trust increases. So, in these complex contexts that we looked at, we could really see trust dynamics which were unfolding of the moment that we were studying, the period we were studying. But we could also see that trust was really it was based on experiences made. There were lots of learning processes, trial and error that we had seen before. For instance, again, in the revolutions I was talking about, for instance, Iraq and Lebanon, the post-conflict societies, the 10 years before the revolutions were extremely intense. Different forms of protest and not experimenting, it wasn't all intentional, but you could really see that people could learn what works and what does not work. Particularly, one lesson was to say, like, working together with political leaders is not going to work, because political leaders are attached to a certain ethno-religious identity, and this will spoil the anti-sectarian approach of the movement, and would split again, would divide. So these things were highly important. And you could see really the lessons learned in the movement. So I think it's like kind of sediments, right? We have to learn about the different, you need to study. So what people learned, who's involved, the networks that also developed are highly crucial. So it's not only about the single actors, but also how they are connected, how they learn to deal with issues, how to build coalitions, how to deal with them. In the special issue I mentioned before, Federico Rossi, an Argentinian colleague, looked at 4 different movements in Argentina and what he calls the organizational dilemma, how different movement organizations work together in coalitions and how they fail and how they learn. So models that work and that do not work, which also calls for more comparative work on that. But this is exactly something we have to, we should do much more in trust research, really to understand the different layers of experiences that were made. And it makes perfect sense also from a common sense logic, right? If trust is like the fact that I rely on someone else and I'm not in perfect control of the situation, I really rely and the other one can do harm to me, of course I would relate back to the experience I had and on how I see these experiences. But there's always agency involved. So we are not just the victim of the past. And this is, again, if I might go back to the Algerian example, I mentioned before that it was so extraordinary that civil war experiences was not preventing people from participating in a revolution. It was actually the contrary. Activists there said, we had this experience of civil war before. It's not going to happen to us again. So the experience of all the suffering was turned into something positive, right? To say that this is something we can learn from its source. And I think this nicely illustrates how long-term developments and the moment of the conflict itself are interconnected.
So you and Hannah Pfeiffer argue that, and I quote here, situations of higher or even extreme uncertainty are characterized by a greater need for trust, while it is precisely this heightened uncertainty which undermines previously tried and tested sources of trust. Apparently, naturally, there exists a tension between rising uncertainty and trust, or so we would think at least, the first making the latter necessary while simultaneously make it more difficult. So I guess, going back and, building on some of the things you've already said, what were the strategies to resolve this tension in the cases you studied? And I think you already touched on some the aspects that are involved here. So how were the actors trying to establish new trust relations and communities, and when were they successful, and what can we learn from that?
So, as I mentioned before, we had this special issue. So there are also other very interesting case studies on how high-risk contexts can be managed. For instance, a Taiwanese colleague, Ming-Sho Ho, looked at the Hong Kong protests of 2019, 2020, and identified 3 strategies how to deal with the high-risk context. Anonymity, for instance, helped there. You would never reveal your real name. Bonding, fascinating, right? How activists and supporters, which is also, of course, crucial in this context, developed almost familial ties. So they called each other brother or mother and father for more elder supporters. So this is something, where you kind of you create a certain tie. Something that we know from social movement research, the longer you protest or the more often you do that, social ties will also increase, right? So there's something going on here. Another aspect is to look at how the protests were unfolding, and emotions play a huge role. Emotions are key here because they are shaped by what you experience. And when you experience solidarity, when you experience self-help, if you experience also greater freedoms that you never had before. I'm talking, for instance, about gender questions, women participating in the revolution in public squares. Suddenly the public space is theirs, something extremely new, that men would defend them against any harassment. So something that you make a new experience and you have this extreme emotion, positive emotion, you build up something new. And this brought people together. But of course, as you said, what works and what does not work, when authoritarian regimes see these bonding activities going on, what do? They infiltrate the movement. It's not only about sheer repression, because fear from the outside might even increase the solidarity within the group. This is something that we can learn from the Iraqi case. Actually, in 2019, the revolution, there were a lot of victims by state repression, but it brought the movement more together. It was to say, like, see how the system is failing, and we are creating a new Iraq. So we have something stronger here. Nadine Sika, who was also a ConTrust visiting fellow, at some point was also contributing to the special issue I was mentioning. She looked at exactly trust eroding strategies of authoritarian regimes, and she made exactly this point. It's not about repression only, it's about infiltration. So you never know who could be a spy, a secret service agent. Of course, activists then try to have some security measures, but can you ever be sure? But there's also cooptation, like a classic instrument in the repertoires of authoritarian rule, to say, like, yeah, bring someone to talk to us, to make them a minister, make them someone, like, really divide and rule. And there you really create distrust within the movements. And as we found, it's really a cat and mouse game. So it's really activists try something out, and then the regime would try to respond to that. For instance, all the talk about social media and how it was building, kind of trust also, but because of communication, it's a free space, but it turned out to be the worst for movements in the end when regimes adapted to it with digital surveillance and so on. So it's now full of distrust and mistrust.
We're almost at the end of our conversation, Irene. I want to close with a question that is very Frankfurt-esque, I should say. So if I understand the paper correctly, you understand trust not only, but mainly as a resource to gain support for contested regimes, a recourse other than coercion. I mean, if I interpret that correctly. So the question that I have for you is if your study provides us with any indicators of when trust is more or less justified normatively, and not merely effective empirically, because as you know, of course, we don't want to take trust sort of at face value, but we want to, interrogate whether that is normatively justified or not, because we are critical theorists of trust. So does your study help us with these kinds of distinctions?
So I think Well, we contributed, first of all, was to say that we really need to broaden our perspective on trust, look at much more different contexts. And if we want to create a joint normative definition or a core of trust, we need to look at these questions much more closely. And actually, there's such a big variety that we found, and so much more need for empirical studies to get to this. I think there could be a normative core for sure. So what all the things that I found is really what people strive for together is living in dignity, right? And people want to trust a political system. Yeah, maybe something we tend to forget these days when we think like populism and then anti-elitism is tearing us all apart. But there is a strong need for a state that is capable of guaranteeing a life in dignity, and a political system that is can be held accountable, that people can trust. They could imagine this form of positive state in maybe the worst context. But at the same time, we're living in a very difficult situation currently when it comes to normative questions, particularly when they come from the so-called West. We see a strong, well, I would say a critical move towards concepts that come from the West. Not a complete rejection, not at all. But we see a strong polarization between, at least on the international level, particularly Germany is very much isolated currently. So is the US, particularly when it comes to the Arab world, but also in general, the so-called global South wants to have a more critical take on these things. And I think an empirical study of trust can bridge this gap and say, like, let's work on this together and take different trust also assumptions into account, get rid of like leftovers of modernization theory. So it's only the democratic institutions that we have in mind that could generate trust. So this is something we need to get away with from. We need to also be more open to other forms of mobilization and organization. We still have a bias also in social movement theory when it comes to Islamist movements, when it comes to also tribal, religious groups, that we tend to think of them like they are something not part of the modern state and so on. And a critical view also from these societies to say, like, what is trustworthy in here and what is not. I think this is the way forward, an open exchange on what people see as trustworthy. But I believe that there is common ground, but I think there's still a way to go to define that.
And this concludes our conversation with Irene Weipert-Fenner. Thanks so much for sharing these fascinating insights with us, Irene, and great to have you on this podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
For all listeners who have not yet had enough, we would like to warmly refer you to Irene's publications, which we link in the show notes. And of course, you are invited to visit our website, where you will find more ConTrust publications, videos, and events, also linked in the show notes. This was the 4th episode of ConTrust, the podcast on trust in conflict. We look forward to you joining us again for all our other episodes, and I would like to thank Irene once again and say goodbye and see you soon.